This lesson is going to focus on the overview of how we digest and absorb food, focusing mainly on the upper alimentary canal. For your reference, the learning objectives that are highlighted in the red boxes are what we're going to be focusing on today, and you should have read pages 148 to 151 of your textbook. These are the key words, as ever, that we'll be referring to today. As we progress through discussing the digestive system, we'll come back and revisit these words, but it's good to be familiar with them and have an overview of where they are. First thing that we're going to be looking at is the alimentary canal itself. Now, what the alimentary canal is a continuous tube that runs from the mouth all the way through the body right down to the anus. So it's one continuous tube, and it has some other structures shooting off, but this is basically it. Now, apart from this long muscular tube, we also have accessory organs. Now, accessory organs are there to aid with the digestion of food. These accessory organs are the mouth, the teeth in the mouth, the tongue, the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder. So the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas are in the abdominal cavity itself, whereas the teeth and the tongue are obviously within the mouth. When we look at the activities associated with these digestive structures and these organs that we'll refer to in turn, there are 6 main activities that we refer to. The first one is ingestion. So this is where we take in food or drink. Then we have 2 types of digestion. Mechanical, which is the breakup of food into smaller particles, or chemical digestion. And this is where particles are broken down into smaller, simpler, and more soluble molecules. And chemical digestion is achieved through breaking chemical bonds. So it's a really important distinguishing difference between chemical and mechanical digestion, and you should be expected to differentiate between the two. So once we've achieved the 2 types of digestion, we then go on to absorption, remembering that the alimentary canal is a tube within the body. So this food isn't into the bloodstream yet. So the small soluble nutrients that we have achieved through chemical digestion are absorbed through the gut wall into the bloodstream. And we know that the bloodstream is a highway for transporting nutrients to body cells. By way of getting these small food particles to be absorbed through the gut wall, we have to move that food along the alimentary canal. And this is done through squeezing food along through a special type of movement. Finally, once we've got all the nutrients that we can, the food then passes out of the body through elimination. So elimination is the removal of undigested and unwanted materials as waste. So we start off with ingestion, we have mechanical and chemical digestion, absorption and movement, and then finally elimination. So here we have a schematic overview of the digestive system with associated organs. So we're going to start at the top here, and we can see that there are structures that we're pointing to here, and these are the salivary glands. Salivary glands are really important. They contain chemicals and mucus that help us to digest and lubricate food. We then have the esophagus, which is the food tube, if you like. So this tube sits directly behind the trachea. The esophagus will then connect to the stomach, remembering this is one long tube. And the stomach sits quite high up in the body, and next to the stomach we have the accessory organ, the liver. We also have the gallbladder shown in green, and we have the pancreas tucked in just behind the stomach. Moving on from those 3 accessory organs, we then reach the small intestine. Now, the small intestine is called so not because of its length, but rather because the diameter is quite small. We then move on from the small intestine to the large intestine, and again, that is called so because of the diameter. So we have part of that large intestine that goes up, so it's called the ascending colon. We have part of the large intestine which moves across, hence it's called the transverse colon. And then finally, the descending colon. So that ascending, transverse, and descending colon are all part of the large intestine. And any undigested food is then stored in the rectum before it is eliminated through the anus. So here is a more detailed description of those organs that I've talked about. Please pause the video here and turn to page 11 in your class booklet and make sure that you fill out the detail. From this diagram, you'll be able to see that there are other parts of the intestine that I haven't mentioned, but we will come to these in turn. Okay, so the start of digestion occurs in the mouth, and the first thing that has to happen is mechanical digestion. So when we take in food, that's referred to as ingestion, and we chew that food up. The reason why we chew the food is because it will increase the surface area to volume ratio, which means that more surfaces of that food will come into contact with chemicals so that digestion can occur at a faster rate. Now there are 4 different types of teeth found in the mouth, and we can group them into 3. We have the incisors, the canines, and the molars, which are categorized as the premolars and the molars themselves. We can see that each of these types of teeth have specific functions, so we can see that with the incisors they have that flat chisel top to them, and that aids with cutting and biting of food. Canines are slightly more pointed. In other animals we know that these are quite sharpened and elongated, but because we are omnivores, ours are much reduced. But the canines themselves are for holding and cutting food, while the molars and the premolars have this ridged surface on them to help crush, grind and chew food. Now, when we're referring to chewing food, we were referring to mechanical digestion, whereas chemical digestion is when chemical bonds are broken, and that involves chemicals. And the one that is found in saliva, which comes from salivary glands, of course, is the enzyme amylase. Now, salivary amylase, called so because it is derived from the salivary glands, breaks down starch, which is a complex carbohydrate, into maltose, which is a disaccharide sugar or a 2-unit sugar. Salivary glands also secrete a mucus, which helps to lubricate the food and allows it to be swallowed with ease. So here we can see in this picture we have a salivary gland at the back of the jaw near the ear, and we have 2 that lie underneath the tongue and underneath the back teeth. Now, again, these salivary glands contain salivary amylase, which breaks down starch into maltose. So it's a good way of remembering this is SAM. Starch, amylase, maltose. And this only occurs in the mouth. So that's where the first stage of chemical digestion occurs. Now, when we chew food, it's actually known as mastication. That is the proper name for chewing food. Hence why the jaw is referred to as the mandible. So chewing food is aided through the teeth and the tongue. So when we chew food, we roll our tongue around in our mouths unconsciously, and what that does is it manipulates that masticated or chewed up food, and it rolls it into this kind of oval, soft, ball-like shape called a bolus. Now, a bolus is then easier to swallow. So now that we've chewed food, we've undergone a little bit of chemical and mechanical digestion. Food will then pass from the mouth down the food tube. The proper name for that is the esophagus. Now, as food is swallowed down the esophagus, it doesn't rely on gravity, and this is really important to know. Okay, so the esophagus is quite a narrow tube. Things would get stuck in it, so it needs to be moved along by muscle. So it's important to note that the alimentary canal is made of smooth muscle. So because it's smooth muscle, there is no conscious control. Unlike skeletal muscle, it's completely subconscious. There are two types of muscle within the esophagus itself and throughout the alimentary canal. So we have circular muscles, which go in rings horizontally throughout the length of the esophagus. And when these contract, they narrow the diameter of the esophagus. We also have longitudinal muscles, which go up and down the length of the esophagus. So when you swallow, you can actually see your throat move up and down. And what's actually happening is the longitudinal muscles in the esophagus are contracting and relaxing. So they're getting shorter to decrease that distance for swallowing. The other thing that's happening, which is quite crucial, is we have contraction of muscles, the circular muscles behind that food bolus, and we have relaxation in front of the food. So it's kind of like squeezing toothpaste. If we squeeze behind the toothpaste, it will come out the tube. If we squeeze in front of it, it's not going to go anywhere. So this squeezing action is known as peristalsis. And this is a wave-like muscular contraction that moves food throughout the alimentary canal. So in this diagram here, we can see that quite clearly. This is describing the peristaltic wave of food as it's being swallowed down the esophagus. So here we have the food bolus. We have contraction of circular muscles behind the food and relaxation in front. So as that food gets pushed down the esophagus, we then have a wave of contraction behind and relaxation in front, and so on until that food is into the stomach bag. Okay, so here's a quick summary of what we've learned so far. We know that food and drink is ingested in the alimentary canal, so keyword, ingested. We know that the alimentary canal is one long muscular tube, and that type of muscle is smooth muscle, and it goes all the way from mouth to anus with the accessory organs that help to aid digestion. We know that mechanical breakdown is the physical breakdown of food into smaller pieces. However, it does not alter the chemical structure of the food. Chemical digestion, on the other hand, is where large, complex, and insoluble molecules are chemically changed by breaking bonds to become smaller, soluble, and simpler. Teeth aid in the mastication of food, so this is the chewing of food, cutting it up into smaller pieces, and that is mechanical digestion. The saliva that comes from the salivary glands at the back of the jaw and underneath the tongue contains mucus, which helps to lubricate that food so it's easier to swallow. And the saliva also contains the enzyme salivary amylase. Now, the job of salivary amylase is to chemically digest starch into maltose. When food is swallowed, it occurs in peristaltic waves. So this wave-like contraction is when smooth muscle rings, circular muscle, contracts behind the food and relaxes in front of it. And this pushes food along the alimentary canal. So once again, the food that we refer to as, once it's been chewed up and is covered in that sticky mucus, is known as a bolus. The food gets swallowed down the esophagus, and there are circular muscles and longitudinal muscles to aid peristalsis. So now that we've done the first part of digestion, here's a couple of practice questions. So number one, after being partially digested in the mouth, food passes to the stomach, Identify the structure that connects the mouth to the stomach. And the second question, name and describe the process that moves food through the structure named above. Now, before you do these questions, you should note the key words in here. In question 1, the verb that we're looking at is identify, so we're just looking for a one-word answer, so we're naming one structure. And in the second question, you have to name a process and then describe that process. So pause the video here and see if you can answer those questions. Alright, so hopefully you were able to get some answers for that, and let's check them off. So the structure that connects the mouth to the stomach is of course the esophagus, and the name of the process that moves this food along is of course peristalsis. You get 1 mark for that. And then describing that process, it's a wave of contractions, and you must mention the 2 types of muscles here. So it's circular and longitudinal muscles, and describing that action, it's contraction behind the food and relaxation in front. Okay, so now we've talked about the esophagus, we're now going on to look at the next part of the digestive tract, and that is the stomach. Here we're going to be focusing in on this part A of this learning objective, and as ever, please ensure that you've read the relevant pages in your textbook. Okay, so here we've got some more keywords. Then it will get easier as we go through them, and hopefully you'll have recognized a couple of them already. So just a quick recap of what we've learned so far. There are 6 stages or activities associated with digestion. So we have ingestion, mechanical and chemical digestion, absorption, movement, and elimination. Again, just to refresh your memory, this is the diagram that we looked at in the previous lesson, and you wrote down the descriptions and the structures on page 11 in your workbook. In today's lesson, we are going to be focusing on what happens to the food as it passes down the esophagus and enters the stomach. So again, we know that the esophagus relies on peristaltic waves through contraction and relaxation of circular and longitudinal muscles, and this has a squeezing action to move that food bolus into the stomach. We also know about chemical digestion in the mouth, and again, just to summarize that for you, it's salivary amylase, which breaks down this large this large starch molecule, and this is the polysaccharide, not a polypeptide, and it breaks it down into a disaccharide, so that's 2 unit sugars. Now, when we look at the stomach itself, it is just a muscular bag. It's not that large, but the size of your fist, and it fills up with food quite easily, but because it is a muscle, it can stretch. There are 3 types of muscle as opposed to the 2 that we found in the esophagus. We have got longitudinal muscles that goes up and down the way. We've got circular muscles which go round, and we have transverse muscles which goes diagonally across. Now, the reason why we have these 3 types of muscles here is to churn the food that's in the stomach. So when all these muscles contract and relax in their different dimensions, so up and down, across the way and diagonally, what that does is it acts like a churning mechanism. So when we churn that food bolus, we're mixing it with the gastric juices. Now that becomes this liquid food now called chyme. This liquid can easily escape from the stomach itself into the small intestine, or it could go back up the way out of the stomach into the esophagus. Now, we definitely don't want that happening. That can cause quite a lot of discomfort. So we have 2 sphincter muscles that seal off the stomach bag. So we have one here at the bottom of the esophagus. Because it's nearest the heart, we call it the cardiac sphincter. and we also have one at the bottom of the stomach called the pyloric sphincter. Now, within the stomach itself, we have chemical digestion as well as mechanical digestion. Within the stomach, there are gastric glands. These are glands that line the stomach or the mucosa, the stomach lining, and they secrete chemicals. The chemicals that are secreted by the gastric glands of the mucosa are hydrochloric acid, commonly shortened to HCl, hydrogen and chloride together makes hydrochloric acid. The gastric glands also secretes mucus and protease. Now, protease is a protein digested enzyme. Now, the enzyme protease will break down protein, which is a large molecule, into polypeptides, which are smaller molecules. Now, how these gastric pits work is, if I show you an enlarged image here, so we've got this folded surface on the inside of the stomach. Now, these are called the rugae, and these are tiny folds. And the reason why we have these folds, if we zoom in on this picture here, this is the lining of the stomach. We can see these gastric pits in the mucosa lining. Now, with these gastric pits, if we're looking at one gastric pit here, so up here would be the inside of the stomach. Within those gastric pits, we've got different types of cells. Now, each of these cells secrete either mucus, acid, or an inactive enzyme into the stomach bag itself. So here I've got a cartoon picture of a gastric pit, and these gastric pits will aid in mixing up and producing gastric juice, which aids in chemical digestion. You have three specialized cells that you need to know about. The first one is gastric protease, which is an inactive form of pepsin, hydrochloric acid, and mucus. Now, we can see here that the mucus cells are near the opening of the stomach. We then have the enzyme secreting cells next, and right at the very bottom we have the hydrochloric acid secreting cells. So you should be thinking, why is it this way? Well, the reason for that is because the mucus acts as a protective barrier, and it lines the inside of the stomach and prevents that muscle being digested by the enzyme or eroded by the acid. So remember that muscle is made of protein, and what we have here is a protein digesting enzyme. So you really don't want anything to digest the stomach itself. Now, also within the stomach, there is no absorption of nutrients, and the reason for this is because that mucus barrier prevents anything from happening. It also protects the stomach from being eroded, as I've said, by the hydrochloric acid. The cardiac sphincter, as I've said before, is the sphincter that connects the esophagus to the stomach. This will stay closed to stop any of that acid from moving up and eroding the throat. And so when you're sick, that cardiac sphincter opens and we eject any of that contents in our stomach out of our mouths. If we do that too often, it can lead to rotting of the teeth and burning of the esophagus, which can be very painful. The pyloric sphincter at the bottom end of the stomach, this keeps the stomach closed until the contents, that chyme, is ready to move on to the small intestine through peristalsis. Now, food is actually held in the stomach for about 2 to 8 hours, so it's much longer than normally what people think it is. So just to recap here, there is mechanical or physical digestion that happens in the stomach, and this is due to the churning action of the muscles in the stomach wall, mixing the chyme with hydrochloric acid and breaking it down to smaller pieces. Okay. The next thing that happens is chemical digestion. So when that food or that chyme is sitting in the stomach for those 2 to 8 hours, what happens is the hydrochloric acid that we looked at that came from these enzyme secreting cells down here, these acid secreting cells down here, mixes with the enzyme secreting cells. And what it does is it activates the enzyme pepsinogen and makes it become an active form of the enzyme called pepsin. So what happens is the inactive enzyme enters the stomach after the mucus, and then the acid enters the stomach and it creates an optimum pH environment. So now that the pH of the stomach is at pH 2, pepsin will work at its peak and it will break down these large protein molecules chemically into smaller peptides. Now, this is only the start of protein digestion, and it will continue on in the small intestine. But this is the first phase of it, and this is the reaction that happens. So to summarize, food is churned in the stomach by the action of longitudinal and circular muscles to mix it with food, and this mixes with gastric juices. The pyloric sphincter stops that gastric juice from escaping into the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Now, the inner lining of the stomach contains gastric glands, and these gastric glands have mucus secreting cells, enzyme secreting cells, and acid secreting cells. The mucus produced by these gastric glands protects the stomach lining from any damage by digestive enzymes and also from the acid. So the enzyme pepsin is made in the gastric glands. However, it's inactive until it's inside the stomach bag itself. So it's secreted into the stomach cavity to break down proteins into peptides. The acid activates this inactive pepsinogen and converts this inactive pepsinogen into an active enzyme called pepsin. The reason for this is because it will stop the pepsin from digesting the muscles of the stomach wall while it's in there. So that's why it has to be switched off, if you like, when it's in the gastric glands. Now, the acid also creates the optimum conditions for pepsin to work in, which we know is pH 2. Because of that mucus lining, there is no absorption of food in the stomach, and we just get chemical and mechanical digestion occurring. Okay, so now we've talked about the stomach. Here are some questions for you to try. Pause the video and attempt these questions, and on the next slide we'll have the answers. Okay, so here are the answers to the questions. Hopefully you were able to successfully write down answers for those. If you didn't, it's really important that you stop here and review your notes and perhaps write out some model answers, flashcards, do some notes to help you remember this content before moving on. Okay, by the end of this lesson, you should have completed pages 10 to 14 of your class booklet, and you should have read pages 142 to 147.